All right, good afternoon. This is the week 8 of our summer 2018 research methods class. Um, we are into the third part of the semester. If you consider the first part was about discourses and setting up and framing a research topic, research questions, which you all ended with having very specific positions in response to research hypothesis or research questions that you all framed. In the second part, we looked into through very specific examples. You were exposed to different methodological frameworks, strategies, and tactics and tools, some more predominantly internal to architecture, like drawing, diagramming, making, precedent studies. Some also embodied or included strategies and tactics beyond architecture, whether it's using media and art, whether it's using photography, videography, whether it's anthropological and anthropometric field studies. We learned about different types of research and how each of these methods can lead us in specific ways, evaluate, test, measure, push against our own hypothesis, our own assumptions, our own positions. And that was the goal of the second part. And so in the final part, which we started a couple of weeks back, was all about so what question, to answer the so what question. That, okay, we have framed a question, we found some information through application of certain strategies, um, we have progressed in our making or design. So what? Why is it important? How we can communicate our results? What conclusions can we draw? Why does it matter? Right? So first week of this third part was all about audience, like who is our audience, what are the motivations of this research, and how we can connect findings and conclusions to that. The second week, which was last week, we looked into readings and examples, especially through the MIT Sensible City Lab, very specific ways of generating outcomes and talking about that. So how motivation and audience connects to how we can present our outcome. So it is about dissemination. It is about um, presenting information in very specific ways, all to create very specific way of communicating the importance and imperative and answering the question that what is at stake? Why should we care about this specific piece of research or design? So this week, which is focusing on your third assignment, the research presentation 3, frames all these questions about the third part, frames questions about audience, frames questions about your motivations, but also adds another layer to that, and that is about context. That any research, any design, any proposition, any outcome always has context. And I should not say one context, it should have multiple contexts. Now, if you look through this week's reading, it really not just tells you context in the sense of a physical context or site. That's the most obvious and most commonly given context to a project, that we have a physical space to put something forward, whether it's a building or a room or a space. And we typically, when we think about context in architecture, that's the first kind of context we think about. But specifically, if you look at readings like comparison through their interviews of Bernard Schumi and Rem Koolhaas, um, that will expose you to not just thinking about context in a narrow physical site term, but how designers and thinkers actually define their context. So how can program become a context, not just program given by your client or your employers, but how can you expand on the notion of program? So if you look at the interview with Bernard Shumey and his design for the World Trade Center Memorial, when he's talking about how the history of the World Trade Center and its destruction through 9/11, the events, how that became a historic context, right? So how that narrative and that time, that sense of fear and sense of security, how a desperation of a country, how these larger discourses, mind the word discourses, of different cultures and terrorism, and these things became part of the context of that project, of that memorial. He also talks about how he connected the events and the temporality to movement of sun, the solar angles, the azimuths and the altitudes, and how that environmental context, right? Another way to think about the term context became an important parameter for his design. Koolhaas, on the other hand, defines, interprets, analyzes context in a very different way. When he talks about cities like Manhattan and Paris and Hong Kong, and he's talking about not just the physical context of density and interaction of people and different opportunities. He's talking about the culture of cities. When he's talking about junk space, which is one of your supplemental readings, not the required readings, he's really talking about kind of the generic nature of the boxes, small, medium, large, extra large, right? His from his book SMLXL, that the city has no order or no connection or no aesthetics, except that it is just a collection of different scales of boxes, and that he calls as a generic city. So that genericness, that vagueness becomes his context for his proposals, where he's arguing that in a traditional way, cities don't exist anymore. It's all about interior and it's all about architecture. So a lot of his projects, theoretical projects as well as kind of practical projects, his competition entries, he's focusing on interiority. And he talks about how the evolution of cities and urban design has really highlighted the role of architecture in the city, not as the external spaces, which we always thought traditionally, right? The public spaces, parks, streets, markets, public buildings, plazas. But instead, he's completely flipping it on its head and making it an interior context. So he's connecting the physical context and the notion of the site, but completely interpreting it based on a cultural evolution and cultural context. So that's something, if you read that interview piece comparing Shumey and Koolhaas, that's a required reading because it really frames how designers not just work with a given context, but how they create their own context. So that's why that reading is really important. There is a related reading which is required, and that's by Eisenstadt. And the title of the reading is Contested Context. And it gives you information about, as we are defining context, as we are interpreting and analyzing context for our projects, how it is not about just one single context or one single thing to which our design and our research should respond to. So he's talking about complexity and layering and multidimensionality of different contexts and their interaction, right? Whether it's physical context like site. Even when we are thinking about site, it's not just the site boundaries, but what's around the site, what is in the neighborhood, what is in the district. So even when we limit ourselves to a very specific definition and boundary of site, there might be multiple layers involved in it and integrated with it. So what the author is arguing in that reading is we have to be always aware of and think about that any context we define will always have these boundaries, some things which are included in that and some things which are excluded. And we need to keep in mind these diverse and varied understanding of even a single context. So those two readings, which you will, if you have not already skimmed through, you are required to go through this week, because those two would really help you form your understanding and apply those in terms of analyzing the case study again that you have selected, and then understanding your own project development through this lens of context. So I would like to actually start with quickly talking about this week and the assignment 3, the research presentation 3. Let me share my screen, and I would like to specifically go over the steps for this week, for which you will have your draft due this Wednesday. And based on how I see the draft coming up, the final will be on Sunday. As of now, I may give you a couple of additional days and move it towards next week. But I want to see the drafts on Wednesday first. Can you see my screen? The Research Methods class website?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So the purpose of working with context as your third presentation is the fact that irrespective of the type and nature and quality of the project, whether it's a basic fundamental research or it's a more applied research or any kind of design project, we always bound ourselves, like we bound ourselves with certain questions and discourses, the same way we use very specific process and information to make decisions. There are always certain limited amounts of elements which frame the context of the project. Now, some are very much physical, like I mentioned, the most common to be the site, the given site. Sometimes it's forces like environmental conditions. Sometimes, like the World Trade Center Memorial Project, it's history and time. Sometimes it's very practical elements like zoning codes and building regulations that influence the outcome of the project and hence become the context. Sometimes it could be the users and people or the community, or maybe a memorial of certain person who lived around, right? So the purpose of this assignment is not to teach you or tell that, okay, these are the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 contexts always present for a project, but for you to think about and find in the case study that what kind of elements can form a context for a project. So is it physical site? Is it money and budget? Is it building regulations? Is it cost but related to material selection? Is it location? Is it user, or is it something else? And the way to arrive at finding important context is to think about what important element has helped the designer, in case of the case study, form their decisions and make their decisions, right? So that's why we are looking into the context as an important driver of a proposition for a project. Whether it's cultural context, regulatory context, social behavioral context, sustainable issues like carbon emissions, pollution, or more qualitative elements of sustainability like resilience and diversity and balance. Or we can think about programs, whether it's a program given by your client or programs derived and interpreted by you as a designer, how these things really frame the project proposition. So you need to do 2 readings, like I mentioned. One is the Kulhas-Shumi article from Praxis, where each architect, both of them are asked 10 questions, and they talk about how they actually look at program. And I want to focus on program as a very specific context because, like site, physical site, program is probably another element that frames a project context, a design context. But program is a little bit different than site in the sense that it is a little bit more complex. And that's why I want you to do that reading where both Kulhas and Shumi talk about programs and very differently, in very different ways, discuss how they define and interpret and use program or programs for their projects. I mean, Kulhas talks about his competition designs like Parque de la Villette, and which was not selected, by the way, but probably is more popular and more written about than Shumi's same project, Parque de la Villette, which was selected. Kulhas also talks about Seattle Public Library, where actually the program of the library, the programmatic needs of the library, like the reading spaces, book areas, employee spaces, circulation, security, all these actually directly translated to spatial organization, spatial configuration, the pushing and pulling, and these were expressed in the final form. But also he interpreted and used the idea of a mixing chambers and kind of internalized from his critique of the city public spaces and interaction spaces into the interior of the library. And that gave those very interesting forms of kind of multi-purpose interaction space in between, for example, bookshelves and reading spaces, or reading spaces and reference areas, or reading spaces and children's areas. On the other hand, Shumi talks a lot about his World Trade Center project and how, like history, like requirement, of course, the competition brief, but he talks a lot about history and connects history to environment, history to climate, history to paths of the flights, all these social, cultural, and temporal aspects of that event as programs, and that helping him creating design, making design decisions, and ultimately creating the form or forms for that complex competition project. And as I mentioned during my introduction, Eisenstadt's talk about contested context really looks into, she looks into how different architects, different projects look at context in different ways. So it's a more general reading and more generic reading, but help you understand even physical context like site, how it can matter, but it can matter differently at different scale and for different purposes. So those 2 readings are required. So if you have started to do that, great, and we can talk a little bit about that. If you have not, those 2 readings you must do before getting into the assignment. Okay. So the research presentation 3 is the primary assignment for this, where you need to present your understanding of the case study as well as your project development through that lens of context. So the first step is I want you to, of course, do the readings, quickly look at how different designers are using context, and then secondly, get into your case study analysis, where go back to the same project that you have selected by the same designer or the firm and see what kind of project context they are using for their project. So do they talk about the physical site? Do they talk about programs? If so, in what way? when they talk about the site, is it just the physical site boundaries itself? What is inside the site? Topography, vegetation? Do they also talk about what's around? Do they talk about typology of buildings around, materials? Uh, so if they're designing a courtyard house, I'm just giving an arbitrary example, are they talking about courtyard houses and the typology in the neighborhood? Do they talk about the typology and the vernacular of the city or the place or the region, or they do not? Are there other factors that forms their context? Does history or culture of the city, do people of the place and their culture, do these things matter, or is it something else? Is it all about zoning code? Is it all about money? Is it all about material? Right. So even if a lot of the projects are about form and aesthetics, and when you are talking or analyzing your designer talking about aesthetics, what kind of elements they point to or connect to, that can frame the context for the project. So that's the second step. So after doing the reading and understanding, definition, understanding, interpretation of an analysis of context, I want you to look at what are the context for those projects according to the designer, and why and how they are addressing these contexts. And try to identify 2 to 3 very specific context or contextual elements from that case study. Okay. And then third, after you have done the case study analysis of the context, I want you to look at your own prospective project, a possible proposition, your own project development, and think about contexts for that project, for your own project. Excuse me. Now, for your project, I want you to look at 3 contextual elements, and within which you are required to consider one of the elements as program. Now, how you want to define program, that is up to you. There is enough reading and case study analysis to provide you and help you frame that for yourself. But one of the contextual elements that you need to highlight and present for your project is program. The other 2 can be anything. Okay? And so these 2 things, the case study analysis of the contextual elements, 2 to 3, and then contextual element development for your project. One should be program, the other 2 can be anything. Those 2 need to be combined together for the final presentation. And these 2 need to be combined into, I would say, between 9 and 12, 8.5 by 11 slides for the final, which would be due Sunday or maybe next Tuesday as of now. Let's move, as of now, let's consider that's on Sunday. But for the draft, I want to see between 4 to 6 slides. Definitely, I want to see a complete case study analysis using your case study project and how you see the designers are using context, 2 to 3 elements. And then I think it would be very useful if at least you can show at least one element for your project. And if you want to do that with program, that's fine. If you think that, no, there is another element that's really a powerful context for my project, show that. But I would like to see at least one context element for your project as well by Wednesday. And it could be rough, quick ideas, quick sketches, quick write-up, quick copy-paste of images, and I'm going to give you feedback on those. Okay? Questions about the assignment?
Yeah, so you want our draft this day, and then this coming Sunday, the final is due?
So I want the draft on Wednesday based on how I see the drafts and based on how I start to give you feedback. I may extend it from Sunday to Tuesday, But as of now, the draft is on Wednesday, and that's not changing.
Okay, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Go ahead.
Last week, you mentioned that since Wednesday, I believe, is a holiday there in the States, that it would be due on Thursday.
For the draft?
Yes, for the draft.
Okay, so let's do Thursday. I am sorry if I forgot and I mentioned that. That's fine. So let's do the draft on Thursday, and let's, in that case, let's have the final due on Monday. And I'm not going to change that, okay? Any
Can you guys hear me? Hello.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so as far as the assignment itself, I just wanted to touch on like my project and what I was thinking for it for assignment 3.
Yeah.
If for those of you who are familiar with my project, it's The Fence by Innaborough, and those who are not familiar with it, it is a project that it was a temporary site where they had these 7-foot fences, actually similar to those that are right there outside this Washington Monument. They are temporary fences to block off the site for security reasons. Right now, they have this 7-foot fence up for the fireworks show, actually, on Wednesday. So I wanted to implement my fence into similar type of sites where they have to close it off for security, or even like even just like a park where it could be the opening or it could be the entrance to a fence. Am I on the right path, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I think you're in the right path about, I mean, overall, I think as a project development, it's fine. And you are presenting the information about a proposition of a project that you want to look at the fence as, and I would encourage you to think the fence as a piece of architecture, and you want to deploy it in specific sites. Okay, I mean, that's kind of the project is about.
Okay,
Now,
cool.
for the purpose of this assignment, I would encourage you to present that information through the lens of context. Now, what is a context? How is it defined? How architects and designers use that? That information you should be getting from the readings, and then by doing this assignment, specifically the first part, where I want to look at how Interborough, what kind of contextual elements they considered for the design of the fences. So for their project on that site, was the context predominantly the physical site, right? And how did they define the physical site? Was it just the shape of the site? Did it matter where was it located? Did it matter what was around, whether it's a train station or a dump yard or mixed-use buildings? Did it matter for them that the context had a lot of people walking around? So that's not a physical site anymore. That's about circulation, and how pedestrian circulation became an interesting and important context for the project, right?
And time, right? And time and place. I think time had a lot to do with it.
Right. So then if you think that time and place is an important contextual element for them, you need to elaborate and explain and then visualize so that we understand how time and place became an important context for Interborough to make very specific design decisions for the fence. And then the second half is for then your project, when you are thinking about deploying certain fences in different sites, what determines the project context? You mentioned sites that need security. So is security become an important context? How do you define security? Is a municipal building which needs security important for putting a fence? Does it need to be a landmark building where a lot of people come from outside? Is that the definition of where security is needed? Is it only temporary during certain events or large gatherings? I don't know. I mean, that's something you need to talk about, that how security becomes an important context for you.
Okay.
Now, one thing that you have to think about, and all of you have to think about as a requirement for your project, in your case, fence in different sites, that how can you think about program for these fences? Is it a program that different people can do different things with the fence, like interborough, right? That it can become a planter, it can become a seat, it can become a partition for privacy. So that's very functional programmatic needs. You can also connect the idea of a program to security, right? What kind of programmatic needs are embedded in security? Is it about separation that determines the height? Is it about strength and resilience that may determine the thickness, right? I mean, fence doesn't have to be a picket fence or just a fence, thin fence with chicken wire, right? So, that's something I want you to think about. That how does the design of the fence, its form, its structure, its organization, its aesthetics, what different things really become the context for those decisions?
I have a question. Can the site, does it have to be something that's already been built, or it's something, or it could be something that's under construction, or it has to be something that's already established? I guess.
For what?
For the site topic, for project selection.
I mean, depending on the project, right? I mean, I may have a proposition that might be siteless. So site, it is not required that you have to have a site. You can have a fictional site. You can have an established real site. That is up to you. You may say that for my project, site doesn't matter and physical site is not an important context. That is up to you. The only requirement I'm putting for your project is one required important context element has to be program. I mean, I was talking about site as an example. I mean, if site is an important contextual element, fine, but that's not a requirement.
Okay, yeah, because I have a site, but it's under construction right now. It's a 5-story building. It's going to be a new medical science building, and I was looking at that. So it's currently
for your case, if there is a very specific project and that is you're thinking in terms of a very specific site, that's great, and you can mention that. But even there, I think I want you to unpack and almost peel different layers and help us understand what is the site context for you. I mean, is it the building and one interior space of the building? Does it matter where the building and what is the shape and location of the site is? Does it matter what's around the site? Does it matter from which side wind and sun and other light come in? So is site just a simple line in a page? Is site just a simple location? Or there are wider ways or broader ways of understanding site?
okay. Thank you.
Yep.
And by broader and wider understanding of site, you mean that for me, I guess that you mean that it could be that a program or element can be implemented in a variety of different sites in the same context, I guess.
Okay, I mean, I think we are muddling some of the terms, and it's important for this assignment. So when you say in the same context, what do you mean? What do you mean by context?
I guess where a site temporarily, for my case, a site needs to be temporarily closed off for security reasons. Let's say it's actually is an ordinance where it's a 7-foot fence, and and it only could have certain entrance points, something in that
Okay. So here there are a couple of things. So when you're talking about the specific sites which need security, the specific sites become the physical context. Okay. So when you say that there is a requirement and kind of a regulatory requirement of a 7-foot high fence, so that becomes a regulatory context. When you say that whole discussion of security, how security is defined, that becomes a security and almost a social, cultural, or political context. So when I say the term context, it does not mean just a physical context. So in your case, based on what we have discussed so far, the site is a physical context. The 7-foot fence requirement is a regulatory context. The notion of security, how you define it, how it is in the project, and I'm assuming a little bit and kind of projecting here from my side, could be a social cultural context. And these three are three different context elements. And you can talk about all of them. The only thing I would say that, like these three, I want you to talk about program as a requirement, program as a context for your project. So you can select physical site and then one of the other two, whether it's security as a social cultural context or the regulatory context of specific requirements. You can select one of those two. You can select the physical site and then program. These three will become three contextual elements for your project.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it would be necessary for us to pick a physical. With my hypothesis, it's more like if A and B, then C, or therefore
Yeah, I mean, you
C.
don't have to, and that's why I was telling Nora that depending on the project, you may or may not consider site as an important context. I mean, keep in mind that this project, even if site is an important context for your project, it's not enough. This assignment is not about informing that site is an important context and this is my site. It's not about picking a site. The assignment is about telling how the site, how the physical boundaries or what's around it, or its shape, its extent, its dimension, how and why it's an important context. And how do you think it matters and shapes the outcomes of your project?
Yeah,
So it's not about picking a site that my site is this location and there is this building, and I don't think Nora just meant that. But even if you don't have a site, if you're discussing another element, it's more about how and why that's an important context. How do you define it as a context? I mean, I can say for my project, money is an important context. And in that case, my responsibility becomes, how do I explain and why do I think money and in what way money is an important context? Okay.
So as far as the program, I just wanted to speak about the program some more. For my case study, the program would be the sculptural garden and that the fence houses.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case that I have here in Washington D.C., the program would be the temporary fireworks for the 4th of July. Am I right in that?
Yeah, I mean, you were right in the sense that that's one way of defining program through functionality. And that's why I'm saying that you need to do the readings and see what are the different ways of thinking about programs.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, I'm behind in that.
Right.
I admit.
Yeah, that's fine. And I think that would expand some of the ideas. And I mean, again, like the site, I don't want to see that as this assignment as saying that, oh, for the program, and these are the two programs for a project. I mean, think about what are the different possibilities of thinking about program. So the 4th of July fireworks is a program one day in a year. So my critical question thinking in that way would be, what happens in rest of the 364 or 365 days? So for rest of the days, is your project irrelevant? So what happens to those fences for those days? I mean, even for Interborough's project, I mean, we can ask the question, I mean, if it's temporary, what happens after that? So that could be an expanded notion of program. And that may even shape your thinking for the project that, okay, for this specific day or these specific events days, it will be used in this way. So the functional and user-based program is this. Other days, it might get used in a different way. Or you may start thinking about, okay, 4th of July is one day. I may have a Memorial Day event. I may have a Thanksgiving Day parade event. I may have a Christmas Day parade event. I may have a Labor Day parade event or something else. Or I may use that in a big Super Bowl, right? So I'm now expanding and kind of expanding your notion of the project of a fence during a temporary event for security to a larger systematic and a more marketable product. So then it's a more notion of a flexible program, and the program might change based on the event.
Yeah, and another idea I had for that fence being temporary is that it can be taken off-site and used in different programs such as parks and entranceways of parks. And even if the fence isn't continuous, it could be a doorway where it's closed for a park. Or
yes. So now you're in your case, the flexibility and how you set the time and place. I mean, those become an important part of the program. And the program is not just simple, basic functionality, but program is also connected to the notion of events, when it happens, the time, the frequency it happens with, and where it happens. When you're talking about doorways, when you're thinking about circulation as a program. So again, I mean, there is no one way or right or wrong way to define program or context. But what I want to see is that what is or what are some of the most important context elements, programmatic elements for your project, and how you define it, how you frame it, how you talk about it, and how you use that to convey the importance for your project.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Other questions?
Another question about program. So for a case study, we should probably use program as one of the contextual elements that we would describe as well, not just for a personal project.
I didn't require it literally, but it would be efficient and smart to use program as one of the elements. Yes, definitely.
Okay, thanks.
Other question about assignment 3? Okay, I think Micah has a question about context, in the sense that I think you all can see the text. I mean, his question: could context in this discussion also be described as design constraint? I mean, I mean, that's a good read. And I mean, you can consider design constraint as context. And specifically, if your interpretation of your case study is where they're using the design constraint as framing context for the project, that's fine, and maybe talk about that. But also, I think context and design constraint, I mean, both are a little bit general terms. So when you say design constraint, or you identify examples from your project, case study project, make it very specific that, okay, how they used money as a design constraint, or how did they use a client's certain observation they observed that the client's behavior or a certain requirement as a design constraint. The only thing is that there might be certain elements which are design constraint but may not be context, and because there might be certain constraint that the architect or the designer used, but that may not form an important context for the project. And it could be vice versa also. Other questions about presentation 3? Everything clear? The readings that you need to do or you're already doing, case study analysis for 3 context element, and then your project development and proposition in relation to 3 context elements, one of which must be program. Okay? And if you have any question as you are doing the readings or working through the assignment, let me know. The draft will be due Thursday, which is July 5th. And then the final will be due on, let's make it 10th. Let's give some more time. Let's make it Tuesday the 10th, okay? So draft due Thursday the 5th, and final presentation 3 due on Tuesday the 10th.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Go ahead.
The video going to be due on the 20th, the prospective date for the video?
I have to look at the syllabus. Give me a minute. You're talking about the assignment 4 research video?
Yeah. I just are in critical practice right now, so I'm
okay.
just like schedule my time according.
Yeah. So when is your last critical practice?
Our final
view?
exhibition is on the 16th.
16th. Okay. So the grades are due 25th, and the classes and the week of the 20th. So I need 3-4 days to go through all of your videos and evaluate that, compile all the grades, and finish it. So let me check what is the current deadline. Do you see a specific date given in the calendar of the video, or you don't?
I don't believe there's any dates on there.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would probably need, 20th, maybe maximum 21st, Saturday the 21st. So I would prefer midnight, 11:59 p.m. Friday, and probably with some grace period, noon on Saturday. So let's say noon on Saturday the 21st, okay?
Okay, that sounds great.
All right. Any other question on the assignments?
When do you think we're going to get grades for research presentation number 2?
Number 2 in the next couple of days. Okay. Anything else? Okay, so I would like to, before I let you all go, I would like to go around the room, and I would like to hear very quickly, maybe one from each of you, one element, one critical element that you found fascinating, or you found important, or you learned something new, or you have question about from last week's class, so which was on research outcomes, design outcomes. It could be from any of the readings, whether it's the Corbusier reading or the reading on the flights and performances, or it could be on the notion of the Fordist, Henry Ford's ideas of Fordism, or it could be on one of the projects from the MIT Sensible City Labs that you found interesting. But I would like a quick word from each of you highlighting maybe one element that you found critical from last week.
The reading that I found most relevant to my project was the if-then reading. I'm not sure if I'm a week behind in that, but
yeah, that was probably the week 6, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I was just my project's on adaptive architecture, and his CAS. I'm drawing a blank now what the what it stood for, but it really touched on my adaptive architecture thesis, and I thought it was very relevant to my project. In that to design a flexible space or an elastic space that can change over time, because projects aren't realized right away, or projects are realized when the program could be obsolete from when they first drafted the project, I guess. So I thought that was the most relevant reading to my project.
Yeah, I think the if-then by Roger Sherman, which was in week 6, nevertheless, I mean, it's important for architecture because the whole if-then presents the idea of a conjecture, right? And specifically for projects that you're talking about with adaptive space or flexible space, multi-purpose space, which is quite strategically used and important part of practice and the discipline. It sets up kind of the value of scenario planning and scenario-based design. Now, the thing to keep in mind is oftentimes we ignore that though it's about flexibility, it's about adaptiveness, it's not actually a blank slate, or it's not that a great solution is something that will work for infinite types of scenarios. And that's why it becomes important that which scenarios, which conditions, which variables, or if I use Roger Sherman's word, which ifs you will select. And that's where the designer come in, that the ifs you select are the input variables you are selecting. So you say that variable 1, 2, 3, 5, 9, and 15 are the most important, because otherwise the architecture or the solution or the approach becomes very vague and generic, and there is actually no point of evaluation. That, I mean, it works for my feelings and it works for everyone, and that's a danger even when we discuss things like public spaces, that it's a universal space that works for each and everyone. And oftentimes, or most of the time, even historically, there has not been a single space that is universally public. It can be argued that there cannot be one space that is universal in that sense. So even when we talk about universal access, universal design standards, there are very specific conditions and specificity we are looking at. And with time and with evolution, we will find that certain design may or may not work for a certain condition, and we have to improve that. So even when we're talking about flexibility and adaptability, keep in mind that the input variables are selective, and it's important it's not just self-generating. It's important to acknowledge that we are selecting certain input conditions.
Sure, and then to just draw that out is that I think that most of the times the then in those scenarios results in a like an inventive product design with the architectural firm, where they invent something new that goes into the space that makes it adaptive.
Yeah, I mean, could be. I mean, that could be something that either invented new or a product that is plugged in. If you go back last week's reading of Henry Ford, he didn't invent anything. He just very smartly and strategically borrowed ideas which were already in place and combined them together for an automotive industry. I mean, I'm not saying he was not innovative, but he was not innovative in creating knowledge, but he was innovative in combining and applying that knowledge, which is equally important in research and design.
Definitely, I can see both sides to that, where something that was invented for one space can be reused for another and drawn out further and further. So yeah.
Who else? Anybody else?
I was looking at the readings for Roger Sherman, and I kind of, when I was reading through the readings, it kind of reflects a lot of what is currently happening right now where I work, and mainly I guess everywhere through architecture. So change and how culture is seeing the environment used, and changes the way the utilization of a space and of the building itself. And I work for a university, and we're always changing spaces. We're changing spaces from an office to it becomes an exam room and make it up to code. Changing an entire building into, we're actually looking at it, and I think it's crazy. We have a lab building, and we're looking at converting it into an office. I don't know how we're gonna do that, but it's kind of adapting those environments of, we no longer need a lab building, now we're needing an office building, and it kind of shows the characteristics in his readings and applying them in real life and real life scenarios.
Right, and specifically for a university, and the context of what you just said, ever-changing kind of requirements, whether it's driven by program or it's driven by academic programs and their changes, or a department or a college gets a new building and they move out, and now a different discipline is coming in and they need maybe a different kind of lab, or they need more classroom. So, I mean, in this case, just to elaborate the example of program, I mean, the idea of a program you can define and interpret differently based on whether it's based on academic programs and departments or based on specific programmatic requirement of specific users. So yeah, I mean, again, I think the overall notion of flexibility is there, but there are very specific scenarios that you are working with in terms of these changes. And then to think about proposition, does that influence how do we think about physical and spatial layouts? How do we think about partitions and construction elements? Do we need to think about lighting in a certain way? Again, I mean, it influences different things, but what's for your project, what becomes the most important element and how you can talk about that?
Right.
Others?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. One of the City Lab projects has actually kind of turned out to be slightly related to my critical practice project, which I found really interesting. It was about community, it was community sensing, it was community identifying in a larger system. So in my critical practice study, we looked at things like in Corktown, where parades would end, where different parts of the city they would suddenly stop or veer off at, and each one kind of showed a different area where the community broke down and started to become a different community. but there was all these kind of areas that weren't claimed by any communities on either edge. And a City Lab project developed a way to take all this information, layer it up on top of itself, and then identify where communities might be splitting in half or collecting in different places. And it kind of really put together, you know, it was a very solid method relating to what I was doing that I wouldn't have come up with on my own, that showed a very clear and concise and very rigorous way of taking the research that I had done and making it into a result.
Yeah, I think the Sensible City projects, I mean, all the projects, I mean, their positioning, their research, their methods, and then obviously the design outcomes, I mean, they are at the intersection of urban design, architecture, and information technology. So the information technology play an important role in how they are thinking about finding information, collecting data, analyzing them, and then deciding what to do with that, right? So in your project, how they are even identifying those communities and finding data about community through different device use or use of social media. I think Sophia, I mean, her microphone is not working, so she gave an example about the robot project where they talked about kind of autonomous transportation technologies in the cities and creating based on use of different modes of transportation, locations, and specifically in a city surrounded by water, right? So I think the key question is, I mean, one part is, Micah, what you were saying about information collection and how they deploy and identify this cutting edge technology, information technology, to identify interaction and use of virtual space by communities, and in that way actually understand the communities better, that where they're coming together, where they're splitting apart, maybe where there are gaps, right? And the second half is what Sophia is pointing out through a different project is, okay, we found this information, what can we do with it, right? I mean, is there a niche market or a niche space we can launch a product, or we can create even a physical space where we are seeing this kind of virtual interaction is dropping off, or should we target physical intervention in spaces where the virtual interaction is actually high and we have already people interacting with one another? And very two different proposal approaches, but depending on the project and what we are looking at and what kind of interaction we are looking at, we can test out these things.
Right. And interestingly enough, that actually relates to the next part of the project that we're going to do, is that we need to we need to identify something that we can do in the future.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, one interesting point that was brought up in the article of architecture as research, architectural design design as research by Dodds and Erdman, was the idea that you know, with the emergence of digital fabrication, there's a whole lot of information that's being developed, but not a lot of knowledge. And I thought that was an interesting point because, I mean, it relates to some of the classes that we have to take in our undergrad as well, such as visual communications class, which, you know, granted, the project that comes out of it, which deals with digital tools and digital model making, is effective because you learn the software and how to develop a model off of that, but you don't really generate information, generate knowledge. You're just generating some type of prototypic form that generates information.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's very relevant, especially with digital softwares, digital fabrication, which has probably more efficient and quicker virtual or physical outcomes, and if we input something, it will generate something. I think in case of direct human work, because of how our brain works, a lot of the processing embedded in it tries to translate, oftentimes subconsciously or unconsciously, translate information and does those filtering and makes those decisions and attempts to generate knowledge. But I think in today's practice and the disciplinary world and technology, there is always this struggle with a lot of information and different layers of information. And then how can we create knowledge that is useful, that helps us make decisions, that helps others make decisions, right? And that's why I think that even the MIT's, the Sensible City Lab is an important way of thinking. Even in their projects like Micah and Sophia, they were talking about that there are, if I want to collect data from social media, I mean, I can do data mining and I will have a lot of information. But then it really becomes, what do I want to analyze? What do I get? And what do I want to do with that? And that's all about generating knowledge. And that's why the whole, this process of this class, that what questions you're asking, that may help you understand which data to select, within that data, what to kind of weed out and what to input into another software, so that the outcome and the ultimate forms that we are creating or we are finding are more useful, relevant information, or in other words, knowledge that can be used. Because any information we put, there will be an information output. Whether it's usable, relevant or not, that's a big question. And that's why appropriate discourses, relevant questions, good hypothesis, good systematic testing and methodological application, all these things are important to create a valid output. And I would say knowledge is a valid output. Knowledge is a valid, useful output. I think Ashraf has commented about the virtual Tate reading and connecting to his case study on Nada's urban folly. And in the virtual Tate reading, when they talk about kind of simulation and simulating kind of different ifs and identifying different thens. And I think what would be critical to see in Nada's project through their process is what kind of scenarios they created and why those were relevant to understand the outputs. Are those scenarios, again, internal to structure, form, aesthetics, right? Because I can input variables like material A versus material B or detail A versus detail B, and the output could be different experience of the aesthetics. I mean, I can also look at input as, I mean, it could be different organization of the form, and what I might do is simulate it with circulation of people, and then the input becomes behavior and action of people, and the perception could be the output. So I think it might be interesting, Ashraf, if you look at the case study and see that what specific elements NADA focused on in terms of input variable, and then what was the output variable in their simulations, and how those were helpful, if you have that information, to then generate the final installation or the final folly. Anybody else?
Yeah, I've read a purpose from theory
Who is talking? I really can't hear it. It needs to be louder. Max, is it you?
Yeah.
Yeah, just be louder a little bit.
Okay, so this is from last week. What's your purpose from to design application? That's by Grote and Wang.
Uh-huh.
They talk your audience and like whether you're speaking to this person, designing audience. Well, I think it's important to remember things can change. Like with who you design for, and I think a specific example of that is designed 50 years ago necessarily isn't like relevant today. And the case study that I'm working works on like kind of like a malleable form that can adjust to its audience and the cultural shifts within time elements. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they like touched and basically just the because in each like design and how that it can be affected.
Yeah, I think it's in the same line of discussion about flexibility and adaptability, and that's always kind of the driver of a project like that. And I think that's where it becomes important that for the designer to understand that there will be cultural shifts. And like you said, that 50 years hence, today's cultural context, today's requirements may not be relevant, right? 50 years later. At the same time, I think, again, it's my personal argument, that it is quite outlandish and quite arrogant to make a claim that just because the form is malleable, that it can adapt to and it can work for any cultural shift. And just because it's malleable, it is universal and the best solution. And I'm not saying, and that's where my critique is for that kind of big claim that this works for anything and everything. Because I think it's hard to project today what will be the cultural values 100 years hence or 100 years later. I mean, 100 years later, there might be certain values that may say that this spatial form itself is redundant. So I think it's important to acknowledge that it is designed based on these cultural values. It has taken into consideration that cultural values change, and it may still work if it changes and we have certain hints. And that's where cultural interpretation, understanding of history, understanding of society is important. That's why you have a general education along with core architectural education, right? I mean, you know about society, you know about world history, you know about American culture. We encourage you to learn and talk about popular culture, art, media, movie, film, music, right? I mean, that gives us understanding and help us project to think about future scenarios. But I think it is important to acknowledge that this design is based and directly targets these values. We have projected that these values may change into these things, but I think it's quite arrogant on the other side, naive to say that it can work for any cultural value. I mean, I would look at it and read that with critique and skepticism.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Others? All right, if you don't have any question, we'll wrap it up today. Just a reminder, the draft assignment 3 is due Wednesday. Sorry, I'm messing this up again today. The draft assignment 3 is due Thursday, the 5th, and the final assignment 3 is due Tuesday, the 10th. Okay. If you have any question in the meantime, email me, and your evaluation of research presentation 2, which is with me, should be up in the next couple of days. All right. Have a good night. Have a good holiday week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.